Yeah, I will. Yeah, it's all here. So no one swear yet. No one swear yet. Yeah. No, we're a little bit live in. Right. Yerka? Yerka? We're now live.
Okay. So, welcome. Thank you all for attending this very timely seminar. The big conversation, backlash against gender justice, and what does it mean for development? We're holding this seminar on the occasion of our program Countering Backlash, holding an annual meeting of our advisory group, which consists of eminent experts and policymakers and others. So we're gathered today here, including online. There's quite a few people online. And we're looking at this tsunami or this current swell of anti-gender backlash across the world. And anti-feminist or anti-gender equality backlash, I should add. And what it actually means, what is it for a start? It's very confusing. We've been caught on our back foot a bit. What does it mean for us in gender and equality work? And what does it mean for development? So let me start by introducing the panel. Here we have Hoda El-Sada from Cairo University on our advisory group. Ida Pettersson from Swedish Agency for International Cooperation. Did I get that correct? Almost. International Development Corporation. Thank you. Okay, so bilateral, our funder and supporter in this program. And Anne-Marie Getz from New York University, also an emeritus fellow of IDS, used to be one of the fellows here. Here we have a current fellow, Tessa Lewin. I'm going to the other extreme of the room, who many of you will know, works at IDS in the participation and inclusive social change team cluster. So we don't know what our clusters and teams are called. Always, I certainly don't. And then we have Bafana Kumalo from Sonker Gender Justice in South Africa. Sonker Gender Justice being a network linked to Men Engage and working on social justice in South Africa. Sohela Nazneen, our eminent fellow in the governance cluster. And we have my co-chair in this seminar is Professor Naila Kabir. Professor and at London School of Economics. And Naila, of course, is very well known to many of you, as many others are, and also an emeritus fellow of IDS. So that's us. Naila and I will be leading a sort of question time format, television show format. We're having a debate up here for most of the first hour. Then we'll invite specific questions from the audience and panelists will respond to that. So without further ado, I shall start by firing a question at Anne-Marie over in New York. We do talk of a tsunami of anti-gender politics across the world, this backlash, wondering why the gender debate today is so different to where we thought we were after Beijing 1995 and in many of the years in between. From your vantage point, and I know your research connected with the UN and UN Women and other organizations, What is driving this backlash across the globe? Just a big question.
Sure.
Straight away.
If anybody wants to answer to that question, you should read the article by Yerger, Chloe, and so on. Oh, you can't hear me? Okay. And I will answer your question, but I'm actually going to start with an IDS story about the backlash and the moment at which I certainly myself first became aware of it. Mick, can't control my excitement. Can't control my excitement. Sorry. So in early 1995, we found out that there was going to be a world conference on women in Beijing. And I just didn't even think about going because China was extremely discouraging about going at all and making it very difficult to get visas and so on. And I certainly had no official role. Nyla, of course, being very famous, was already invited months and months before, flight paid and everything else. And I had a PhD student who had found out that somebody from DFID that she knew was going, and she's like, damn it, if she's going, I'm going. And then I was like, damn it, if Sheila's going, I'm going. And then suddenly we had a group of people, including Lila Mehta. Did you come with us? I'm just trying to remember.
I was leaving.
You were already there because we saw you there, right? Sally Baden.
I refused to go.
Oh, you didn't go. Okay. There was all these years I felt jealous of you for that. Okay. Anyway, so Sally Baden and I and others, with Lila, we fundraised, we had bake sales, we sewed our own banner that we were going to take with us, and we made our own t-shirts to go. And John Toy, bless his heart, rest in peace, he gave us each 700 pounds for the cheapest airfare we could find to get to China and everything else we had to cover. Okay, that's all irrelevant. What's interesting and relevant is just two things. Even before going, we, of course, researched what's it all about, and the entire document, the magnificent agreement and platform for action, had the word gender bracketed throughout in square brackets. Because the Vatican felt that the use of the word gender implied the feminist definition of gender, which is that gender is mutable, is interpreted, is a social phenomenon. And they proposed to replace the word gender with sex. Now, you may well ask, why does the Vatican have say at all in this? And it's a good question. We'll answer that some other time. But the Vatican managed to get Argentina, Guatemala, and a number of other countries to agree to substitute sex for gender. They lost that fight. Meanwhile, we made a t-shirt, and it was Sally Baden's genius idea to make a t-shirt for the conference that said, who needs, square brackets, sex, when you can have, square brackets, gender? Now, of course, Mark Robinson said, who needs gender if you can have sex?
1 minute.
Okay, anyway, second thing about Beijing is in the bathroom of the official conference, which we snuck into, on the floor of the bathroom, I found a document saying, the front of it said, Gender, the Deconstruction of Women, by Dale O'Leary, who's a Catholic theologian, in which she explained the backlash, everything that was to come, and explained the basis for the radical uncertainty and anxiety about gender, about feminism. That, men could be women, women could be men, how awful. So, there has been a long brewing backlash, and you guys date it to long before then. Okay, so very, very quickly, what are the drivers of the backlash? It depends if you think it's simply a knee-jerk reaction and a visceral response to the idea of female sexual, social, economic, and political entitlement as well, or if you think that patriarchs actually recognize suddenly that women actually have serious power. They have political power. They can change regimes, such as in Sudan, at least temporarily. They're on the streets. They have political power. They have economic power. They have power to take control of their own reproductive functions, sexual functions, and even gender identity. So that's some of the things that we've been debating, whether or not it's, whether the backlash is about localizational idea, or whether it's actually a much deeper reaction to understanding of what's happening to the deep structure of patriarchy.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. Wonderful. Nala, would you like to enter the debate and lead some questions? I mean, this is very general so far,
yes,
the big sweep.
Yes. Well, I think I'd like to pick up on the last 2 points that Anne-Marie made. And I think it is not coincidence that the backlash gathered momentum very soon after a period when feminists around the world saw themselves as having made some considerable advances. particularly the Beijing conference was seen as a highlight of, getting a lot of women's rights onto the mainstream agenda. And I think that played out quite differently in different parts of the world. But a world where male authority was already being weakened, particularly at the national level, by the forces of untrammeled globalization, cutbacks in social services, austerity, things that propped up the power of the male breadwinner were being slowly undermined by the forces of globalization. And different countries reacted to the loss of privilege in very different ways. So in the United States, you got the white working class, uniting around Trump against migrants, against reproductive rights. In a lot of the Middle East and South Asian countries, it's religion that provided the kind of ideological defense against what was happening in globalization. So for me, this was a project. What men across the world, and I'm not talking about all men, we have to talk in these generalizations, but a lot of men across the world saw women making gains at the same time as they saw themselves being pushed back. And perhaps as feminists, we could have been a little bit more sensitive to building alliances across. But I do think it was that, and that's what I'm hearing in all the field work that I do. It's divided in Bangladesh between, yes, women are empowered, that's very good, and yes, women have been empowered, and men have been, marginalized and are being disempowered.
Yeah. Does anybody else on the panel want to respond to some of the very, very quickly, and we have 3 or 4 minutes, 5 minutes perhaps, specifically on anything that Anne-Marie or Naila had said in terms of the origins of, well, not the origin of feminism, but historical contextualization in relation to Beijing and other things.
I don't know. I want to ask Anne-Marie a question.
Okay, well, maybe.
In terms of, you told us what was happening at Beijing, but then you have been in international spaces. So maybe more stories? One more story?
Very quickly, but Tessa has something.
Well, I was just, in terms of that, could you talk about it in relation to the move out of the international space and into a kind of anti-gender transnational movement, perhaps?
Sure, I'll try. In some ways, it's easier to talk about the symptoms of the backlash or the signs of the backlash than the causes, because the causes are still baffling in a way sometimes. Some of the sort of things that we've seen happen and being negotiated in international space are the reprivatization of women's lives and the deinstitutionalization of structures to support gender equality and justice. So the reprivatization is the pushback against, obviously, reproductive rights, domestic violence, massive loss of ground on domestic violence, actually, reassertion of male privileges in the home.
And cutback of social services.
Goes together with that, which is part of neoliberalism, of course. And then the deinstitutionalization is the overnight transformation of the Ministry of Gender in Afghanistan into the Ministry of Vice and Virtue, which is the most extreme case. Brazil also had an extreme case, and so on. So those are the symptoms. But you asked about transnational space. So international agreements are under huge attack. The Trump administration, for example, his the Department of State refused to refer to the Beijing Platform for Action. They wanted to erase it from UN documents. And it's just depressing that that is the farthest we have come on women's rights is the 1995 Beijing Platform, and then regional agreements like the Istanbul Agreement, of course, Convention have made a lot of strides. Tessa, what specifically would you like me to say about transnational anti-gender movements?
I guess I'm probably interested in the point at which the SOGI and
Use the microphone.
sorry.
Thanks.
I'm quite interested in connecting not just the gender equality agenda, but also to SOGI and intersectionality, and whether you have anything to say about that in terms of in the UN in particular.
There is a concerted attack on sexual orientation, gender identity, and of course, comprehensive sexuality education, which is seen as a pathway to that. And that, I believe, started to become very evident in the breakdown of the CSW in 2011, which broke down exactly on that. And then, of course, the Commission on Population and Development has been just chaos. But there, what we're seeing is small African countries, small African states, and Central American, very Catholic countries bearing the torch on this. And I think actually you have more information than me on funding networks, Christian evangelicals, as well as very conservative member states working together to finance and prepare negotiators to attack these rights. But maybe you should say more because you know more.
Okay, so using the privilege of the chair, we'll probably come back to some of these debates, and we'll be asking you specific questions so you can lead them into.
Okay, moving from the international to the national, I think we've all noted some similarities between developments that are happening in the US, in Brazil, Eastern Europe, India, Turkey, and elsewhere. But of course, there are big differences as well. You know, we all are coming to this from very different histories and contexts. So given the visibility of the Cairo ICPD in 1994 and the Istanbul Convention, the broader MENA region has provided quite interesting flashpoint for the oppositional politics on gender. So how does it look in Egypt and the MENA countries today? What do you think is locally specific about what's playing out in the Egypt and MENA region? And what does it share with the broader? So I'm asking about this.
Thank you.
Thank you. So building on the points made by Anne-Marie and
3 minutes.
Naila, don't worry.
Sorry.
So yes, my starting point would be this historical moment where I would ground the issue of the backlash, other than going back historically. And I think that I see 2011 as a radical transformative moment in the history of the region, but also in the history of the world, I would argue, where we saw, basically political spaces opening up in non-democratic contexts, and these spaces were actually filled with and occupied by activists, rights activists, but also women's rights activists. So once this opening happened, these spaces were actually filled and occupied and used in many very good positive ways, right? So I'm going to just focus on how I see the backlash in that particular context and why is it a backlash against this particular moment. And therefore, the backlash, the gender backlash is really part of a backlash against rights activists, activism, people's power, really. The idea that people can actually change political systems, people who have lost faith in democratic institutions, and therefore they just go out on the streets and change things. And this is really what happened in the Arab world for a certain period of time, where there was a lot of hope, a lot of activism. And in this context, women can be singled out because there was a very, very strong perception of women's power. This was then celebrated, documented, and therefore became a target for the backlash, I would argue. So who are the actors of the backlash? I mean, I can just call them anti-revolutionary forces in countries that want the status quo. They don't want to change the political system. They're happy with what they have. And therefore, there's this backlash against all the people who want to change it. But definitely women become the easier target. So it's really, so I'm just linking this, yes, there's a gender backlash with a larger backlash against activism and the very idea of the ability of people to change and to transform the body politic. Now, what has been happening? I'll just mention one issue that kind of really was highlighted during the Arab revolutions, which was the issue of sexual violence against women on the streets. So sexual violence against women protesters. This was a huge issue for a couple of years, 2012, 13, 14, into 15 a little bit. And so two things. So we saw women forming intervention groups, men and women actually, but led by women, intervention groups who actually gathered, organized, and they intervened during protests to protect and support women who were subject to sexual violence. And these were really, I mean, there's been documentation of this. There's this brilliant book that was just published called Radius. I recommend it. And it documents the experience of a very famous group called Opantish, anti-sexual harassment group. So this was really important. But then what happened was that this issue of sexual violence was picked up. 1 minute, right? So trying to share some positive things. So because right now things are not so positive, but definitely the taboo around sexual violence was broken. And feminists actually managed to support survivors and document and encourage them to go out in public and actually talk about what happened. And all of this actually led to concrete changes. So the Constitution had an article that actually committed the state to combating violence against women. A law was changed that criminalized sexual harassment in Egypt in 2014. So these were all very positive things that happened. And this was all really done by women's groups. I'll stop here.
Okay.
Thank you very much. I'm glad you stopped on a slightly positive note. I'd like to pick up a little bit on that and then hand it over to others. One thing that strikes me, we talk about the gender backlash, but it is a part of a broader set of very populist, backward, retrogressive movements. And if we take on a very intersectional approach to the gender backlash, yes, women as a group are being targeted, but in almost every country, it is those women who are at the intersections of specific, deeply entrenched inequalities that suffer the most. In India, it is about religion and caste. In Brazil, it might be about Afro-descendants and so on. And then amongst women, of course, you have amongst gender, you have the outlawed genders, which for a long time was not a part of the international agenda, but it is coming forward and is also being targeted in a very specific way. So there's something about the intersection approach that also allows you to disaggregate precisely who they're targeting. Because we also have to recognize that patriarchy has its own handmaidens, the women who are willing to go along with the repression of women's rights. Anyone else?
No, I guess.
Thoughts on that?
We can move on.
I'm just wondering, what are your Twitter story?
Sorry.
I was just thinking about your Twitter story that you told us earlier as a positive ending. And
okay, yeah. So I have to say I love sharing positive stories. I guess I think we have to. Yes, so basically I shared with my colleagues here a story about a campaign that was conducted in 2021, which was to reject a draft law that was, that was a draft law that was proposed, sent by the cabinet to parliament for endorsement. And it was a personal status law, a new kind of modification of the personal status law. And it was worse than the one we already have, which is already just quite horrible. So there was this campaign that was called El Wilaya Haqqi, which basically translates into guardianship is my right, that invited women to tell the stories about problems they face in their daily lives because of personal status law. So things like even transferring your children from one school to another, all sorts of very, very bizarre stories, frankly. But this campaign was extremely powerful, and it became the second most popular trend on Twitter for a week. And it really raised consciousness. It allowed women to, step back and think about what is it that they can, women MPs were, for example, quite shocked to find out that, they're MPs, but there are so many things that they cannot do at the level of, with their families and for themselves and so on. So this was another, this was a social media campaign that I would argue stirred the waters, made, and has, I would argue, also paved the ground for perhaps a good modification of the personal law. So, though I'm saying this, and I'm trying to be very, very positive, I'm not sure, but anyway.
So thank you very much, Hoda. And I'm trying to be a timekeeper as well as the co-chair. So these issues around awareness of our women being, including women politicians, being aware of their political and personal rights is my own theory is around how we how we understand our bodies, families within our nations, and the level of lack of awareness sometimes, or the contestations around that. And I'm wondering, within the sort of more broader media, we're seeing veritable culture wars over language around our bodies, our families, and so on, often very nationalistic discourse as well. But also we've seen how the uses of those terms sometimes shift and they get co-opted or change meaning, including by actors who are very anti-feminist. So I'm going to ask you, Tessa, a question about how are different and new actors using language and discourse in terms of international development space? And I'm thinking about gender, SOGI issues, for example, but that issue about discourse capture, co-option, shifting meanings. You want to hold this, or you got one?
I'll use this one. Thank you.
2-3 minutes, please. Sorry.
Yeah, sure. So with great sophistication and what someone recently called malign creativity, and as Butler says, using any rhetorical means necessary. And I think I've been working on this idea of discourse capture, which borrows from the notion of state capture. And those of you who are South Africans will very strongly recognize this. And it's one that's characterized by intention, scale, and its undercover nature. And it jeopardizes, as everyone said, these hard-fought gains around sexuality, reproductive rights, education, gender-based violence. And I think it's about plugging into a very diverse set of existing anxieties. And I think that its incoherence and its broad ranginess is part of its power. So it kind of thrives on dis and misinformation and on contradictory and incoherent claims, which is part of its slipperiness, right? And I've been looking at how discourse capture operates and how one might disaggregate its kind of mechanisms into parts. And one of them is around resignification. And the most obvious example of that is that gender is articulated as an analytical category, which was, by the way, a rhetorical device invented by the Vatican to work as a symbolic glue, which a lot of people have written about in terms of reasserting patriarchal power. And also we see in Hungary and Poland in the attacks on gender studies. And then the second kind of mechanism is the shifting, which we see in pro-life activism in the States and also in Ireland. So the framing of abortion, which used to pit the mother against the unborn fetus, then becomes about, in the Irish case, loving both the mother as a kind of more friendly version of anti-abortion activism. And then the third one is mimicry. So in Uganda, we have the main organization leading the anti-homosexuality bill, calling itself the Interfaith Rainbow Coalition Against Homosexuality, appropriating the rainbow symbolism of the queer movement. The La Ola Celeste, which is the anti-abortion movement, adopting a blue scarf against that of the La Marea Verde, the green scarf in Latin America. And then the final, or the fourth kind of category of discourse capture is twisting and repurposing. So this idea that gender equity is an ideological colonization, which the Pope, I believe, has talked about in terms of, which obviously aligns the church with some kind of indigeneity, ironically, right? And I think Neville Hoad has written about that very interestingly in Uganda. And as to what we do about this as progressive actors, I guess the first thing is to recognize and name it. And I'm sure I'm out of time, so.
Thank you. Well done. On time and in content and analysis. Do we have any reflections on those ideas around discourse?
Yeah, I'd like to pick up on an example that I think we have. It may not be unique to Bangladesh, maybe broader, but it's the discourse of rights and the way it's been used by religious by Islamist forces, let us say. And what it does is it pits the individualistic notion of rights that is associated with Western liberalism to the idea of rights as conditional on duties. So if you do not, abide by the duties that are ascribed to you by the Quran, you forfeit the rights that are given to you by the Quran. So it's of course the Quran has rights, of course Islam has rights, but those rights the problem is, of course, those who infringe their responsibilities are not held to the same account if they're in positions of power compared to those who infringe their responsibilities if they're in. So a man who does not act the role of responsible breadwinner, et cetera, is not held to account. But a woman who may want to go out to work to look after her children is held to account. But the language of rights has become very strong, I think, in the Islamist discourse.
And just to add, and we have actually published a working paper on this, which is a master's student's dissertation, ex-master's MA gender student. And it's about the pitting of rights. So the mother's rights against children's rights, in the case of India, for example, which is a similar. Yes, true. Yeah.
Any other comments?
I don't know. I was wondering if Anne-Marie wants to talk about non-Western language.
On the spot? You're not being put on the spot or anything?
Yes, exactly.
You want me to talk about gender apartheid? All right. It was actually Chima there. Chima is on the advisory board. He of our group over the last few days and raised the challenge of finding locally appropriate languages and means of pushing back against the backlash, locally intelligible frames, which I think is an extremely important project, obviously. And I was just sharing at the international level, it relates to the human rights frame for thinking about the backlash and the defense of women's rights, as well as, the SOGI rights, the sexual orientation and gender identity and so on. So there's a debate underway now. It's extremely important in relation to mainly Afghanistan, but also Iran, which is there legal and above all political mileage in describing the Afghanistan situation as gender apartheid? The legal side of this is in itself extremely interesting. There is no legal imperative in the world really to defend women in a situation like Afghanistan. There is a crime of gender persecution as a crime against humanity in the ICC, in the Rome Statute. But it has only ever been included in one indictment of a Malian rebel with the group Ansar Din in northern Mali. And it's never been seen as a reason for international action. There is also the failed idea of responsibility to protect, which triggered, of course, the NATO bombing of Libya and the repercussions subsequently. So I'm working with a group of thinkers who are thinking about, well, what if we applied the concept of gender apartheid to Afghanistan? It has been attempted in other contexts, such as Israel-Palestine. There's actually a really interesting backlash coming from within the UN, and I can't say from where, with regard to this concept saying, well, perhaps that's a Western idea. Perhaps that's applying a Western notion of human rights, which is extraordinary to say, since the idea came from South Africa, from the ANC's struggle. So it's an amazing thing to say. And would it be said if it was anything but gender in front of apartheid, which makes you wonder, like, how widespread and deep is the backlash? So anyway, it's an extremely important debate. Obviously, the political use of gender apartheid would be excellent, but I would like to point out the Global Convention Against Racial Discrimination was written in 1969, ratified in 72, I think, 71 or 2. The General Assembly resolution against apartheid in South Africa was passed in 1973, ratified in 76. A global revulsion against white supremacy linked to the anti-colonial movement, which is the story of the 20th century. And of course, the anti-slavery movement. If we were to work on gender apartheid, the backlash does make you wonder, could you get a global revulsion against the persecution of women? Given the state of the world today, it is the project of the 21st century to have freedom and not to have gender dictate your rights. But can we get a global action in the context of backlash?
Thank you. Here.
Yes. Okay, I'm going to come.
Excuse me.
And we touched on the role of religious networks and fundamentalist movements in pushing back on progress and for gender justice. How should we understand? I mean, we position religion very often as part of the enemy, right? We've also talked a lot about issues of affect, and religion is tied up with issues of affect. So how should we, as progressive activists, understand the role of faith and religion in the backlash and in the counter to the backlash? I wondered if you had some things to say.
Well, thank you very much. To ask an African to answer such a complex question, especially on religion, in 3 minutes is quite a tall order. That's even more compounded. Well, religion is a very important and strong influence in my religion, in my region, and it's an important player. It is embedded in patriarchy, of course. The mistake that many of us make is that we assume that religion is untouchable, it's sacrosanct. We have learned through the apartheid struggle, anti-apartheid struggle, of course, that religion is actually a site of struggle. It is contested space that needs to be disrupted in terms of its agenda, because it often works to regress what is progressive. We've experienced, for instance, a coordinated backlash against progressive policies, and the case in Uganda on the anti-homosexuality law is a case in point, which has not just, by the way, suddenly come about. It's been consistent, it's been coming along for quite a while, fueled and sponsored by dollars from the US, targeting particular institutions that are strong and individuals that are very key in our society. And the bigger question, therefore, is how do we begin to roll back this backlash? Because we are already seeing that they are moving now to countries like Kenya, Malawi, Zambia, with a similar zeal, including my own country in South Africa. The implications are dire, of course. We're already experiencing not just pushback against LGBT rights, but also sexual reproductive health and rights. I saw a video just this morning being paraded in South Africa against comprehensive sexuality education. Now there's a scarecrow that is being sent to parents that the major satanic thing in South Africa now is the education department wanting to introduce comprehensive sexuality education. This in a country where we already have high levels of teenage pregnancies. We are a very funny society in South Africa. We all know we love sex, we all have sex, but we all pretend when we're in public that we don't. And how do you deal with that conundrum? And I think we do need to relook at what I call contesting this space, so that we do not allow religions to simply have a free rein, to do as they wish. And many of those like me, I'm a clergy person by training, have to use that space meaningfully to encroach and challenge some of these narratives, challenging scripture, how it is interpreted, how it is misread, actually ideologically, to reinforce patriarchy. And I think it can be done. All I'm asking is that we all need to take up this challenge and really push back, even against religion. Because religion is not sacrosanct. It's an institution, yes, of people that relate, but it can't be taken for granted that everything that people say is the gospel. That must not be taken for granted. Thank you.
Time is up. Thank you very much. And it is not easy for anybody from anywhere to answer this question, but I wonder if anybody else here has something to add.
I think we're all very good.
Did you want to say something?
I just on your point about seeing religion as an institution that can be edited and shaped and contested, I think that's important to bear in mind.
Yes.
In all
I should tell you about my mother. worked with landless women and men in Bangladesh. And there was a division amongst feminists about whether we take on the Quran and read it through a feminist lens, because the Quran lends itself to many different kinds of interpretations. Yes. And my mother took a very uncompromising position that you go down that route and you're going to end up in a cul-de-sac at some stage. I don't know who was right, but it is a living debate. Yeah, sure.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. So quickly, totally agree. This is also, I mean, this is obviously a very hot debate in Muslim countries. But then the reality is that in the last 10 years, there has been this fantastic intellectual movement of Islamic feminists. And they've been producing really amazing knowledge that is being used to counter, to do so many things. Now, there's still not, I mean, they haven't yet moved to the mainstream, but it's been, I think, I follow Islamic feminism, and I think the work is brilliant. And really, I think it's an important mission for feminists to debunk, all these religious arguments about, why women should be in a particular place and so on. And eventually, we need to find this rapprochement between sort of like the secular feminists and the Islamic feminists, because I think the division and the antagonism between them so far has not helped anyone.
I think this is about discourse recap.
Yeah.
Are any more points on this?
On that.
Faith and religion?
Yeah, I mean, if you grew up in a context where religion is very important, I don't think you can ignore it. Even if you don't want to engage with it, it encroaches in your lives and you are judged by its standards. So there's no way, sort of, even as a secular feminist, you can just ignore that it exists, and you need to find ways to engage. And I mean, of course, you can reinterpret the text and provide more interpretations that are freeing and liberating for women, but it's also political in terms of whose voice counts and which space are you in. But having said that, creation of alternative narratives is very important, because that's how you counter backlash also, because there is a mainstream narrative about this is what the religion says you're supposed to be. You need all kinds of weaponry in your arsenal, whichever way it works, and you take it down.
Yes, a quick reply.
Very quick response. So we've been talking a lot about the movable middle. And this is really important for the movable middle. And we have so many examples of campaigns where we actually used feminist religious arguments that convinced audiences that are very conservative, but all women want to be free and to feel good about themselves, really. But you just have to give them the ammunition and the knowledge to be able to say, yes, I can still be a good sort of Muslim, but be able to do this and that. So, and it's affect, and of course, and the affect is good.
Anyone else? We have a minute or two left of this one. Okay, so from religion and from discourse as tools to understand as well as to counter backlash, I'm wondering, we hear a lot about, it usually tends to start with debates about, queer issues or migrants, the migrant flow and so on. But many say that eventually they come for women too. So it gets generalized and it gets more complex quite quickly. So Hela, as you were, and some examples might be like abortion rights in the USA recently being rolled back, attacks on sexuality education in Brazil or South Africa, as we just heard about, and other things like laws affecting the personal status of women in South Asia, for example, or in the Middle East for that matter. Now, from your research and so on, how significant do you think, and how useful is it to look at specific policy areas as sites of struggle for this backlash politics, and what are the implications for development? Maybe with some examples from the work in Bangladesh and elsewhere.
Sure. Sure, time me. I tend to go over. Hello, gender people. In one line, when you're asking what is the impact of development, it's going to the rollback of rights and the policy gains, whichever policy area that we are looking at. Some of them are very gender specific. Some of them are sort of falls in the larger basket, but will have a significant impact on women and gender diverse people. But the impact will be intergenerational and the impact will be intersectional. Nala, what we were talking about, that who are at the specific intersections that are at the most marginal or the most disadvantaged, right? So Yerker, you mentioned SRHR, we talked about issues around sexuality, right? So when you roll back the gains, whether that's gain around abortion or whether that is about equal rights for gender diverse people, what you're doing is you're affecting people's rights and access to services in specific ways. So be that around in health, be that around in whether you can access services, or be that how they're seen as citizens and how you are free to be yourself. So that has a huge development impact for these segments of different groups of population. But apart from that, there are areas where we are seeing rollback or the debate has gotten stuck. So you mentioned family law reforms. Hoda, you shared with us a very positive story, but the story is not positive for the countries where we are looking at, because these things are very sticky. You have in development, let's say we have actually gained first generation kind of rights, in a sense, right to work. Okay, nobody challenges that yet, that why women are working, they need to work because families are poor, you need to take care of families. I mean, how do you participate equally if you're not equal in private? If you don't have marriage equality, if you do not have equal rights to divorce, you don't have equal rights to inheritance. If you're unequal in private, you're not going to be equal in public, period. And where the debate has gotten stuck, and with the way Backlash has framed the issues, we are stuck there. So that is going to have an impact in where we go in terms of what we have gained and how far can we gain. The third area is around policies that we see in terms of cutback in services, or Anne-Marie, you were talking about dismantling of certain institutions that ensure gender equality, or that questions the state at what are you doing about domestic violence, or that women need particular types of social services, or disadvantaged groups require particular types of help. So if the cut is there, then that's also about economically, and we are already seeing that rollback across many different countries. And the last bit is about democracy and participation. So think about the laws that have been passed in many different countries, whether that's controlling the social media, whether that is about how you protest and have sort of activism, controls around NGO funding, and how is that going to affect the organizations that fight for women's rights, that fight for gender diversity, that fight for countercultural issues when the space is going and you can be persecuted. And that will have an impact on what you see in development planning, what states prioritize, what you can question states on. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for that tapestry of relevant development areas and impact from rights, work, the economy, governance, and so on. Other thoughts, policy areas. This is the battleground within development studies are quite often.
I'm struck by something you said. I'm not quite sure what my thoughts on it are. Is, if you don't have equality in the private sphere, how can you have equality in the public sphere, right? But actually, you can use progress in the public sphere, in the sphere of work, in the sphere of politics, to start challenging inequalities in the private sphere. So I would like to see it as a two-way relationship in which what happens in the private sphere has a hugely important influence, but we still nevertheless manage to make progress because governments decide, or somebody decides that you will have the right to work, or you will be represented in local government or whatever. And one can use that to start challenging the way budgets are allocated, to the way the laws are framed and so on. So I'd like to see it as there's no impenetrable barrier between them? You know, the thing kind of flows.
It flows, but at the same time, it limits you in specific ways. So let's say you don't have equal inheritance. You want to run a business. What's your collateral?
Yeah.
Unless your family is helping you out, how do you negotiate with the bank? So I'm not saying you can't participate in the market, but you are at a disadvantage compared to those who will get more. So it's about, like, different countries have different forms of control when it comes to personal law. So what Hoda was talking about, that you can be an MP, you can decide things, but you can't transfer your kids to a different school. So it's about limits to that freedom, and how then it becomes, even if the state guarantees you certain rights, you're not completely as an equal citizen as a man is, because you have to count politically.
See, the thing about inheritance rights is it is, again, one of those entrenched structures of patriarchy, right? And it's a hard one. So in India, they've passed the Hindu Succession Act, and it hasn't made all that much difference. But in Bangladesh, Islamic law does allow you half the share of your brother. As women become slightly more empowered in the public domain, they are taking up and challenging the right to have those rights. So it's not, again, but I'm just trying to challenge the idea that unless everything changes in the private sphere, we can use opportunities in the public sphere to leverage some change in the private. I think that's the...
Absolutely.
I didn't contest that, but I'm saying you still need to be equal in that.
Yes. Sorry, we just have a couple of minutes left on this, actually. And this is a fascinating conversation, because, of course, I'm thinking, personal is political, and it's so many different levels. And it's no coincidence that that is a feminist rallying cry from many, many decades back.
And then
Tessa.
the binary, right, which we've been talking about a lot
Yes,
in the last few days.
in the binary, the
Yeah, but
formal
also,
and the formal.
yeah, thank you.
Sorry.
I was
We
actually
have
just,
about 2 minutes left.
I only need less than that. But I was just thinking about the life of this program, and as we're talking about development and kind of how things impact on us. And I was thinking about closed civic space and how that we have, as researchers, been impacted by contemporary politics in the last 6 to 9 months. So we had a meeting a year ago, almost exactly, in Uganda, as an openly kind of queer activist and scholar. I'm not sure that I would be doing that this year. For example, I probably wouldn't be allowed out by my family, but we've been setting up a partnership in Turkey that has fallen through because of increasing kind of political repression. We are organizing closed door meetings with activists in other spaces because it's not possible to have them as part of the conferences that we're organizing. So just at the level of this program, there's massive, significant kind of changes in the last 6 months.
Thank you. So do you have the last question?
Yes. So the last question is to Ida. And that is, how does it look for development agencies like CEDA, all of this conversation that you've been participating in for the last few days? And what do you think the role of organizations like CEDA, who are still fairly progressive, is in the face of backlash? And what would your recommendations be to IDS and to this program?
Yes, thank you. 2-3 minutes.
Thank you very much.
3 minutes, I think.
So, first of all, let's just say that gender equality is one of the 5 prioritized areas for CEDA to work within. So that makes us a bit easier to work on the backlash as well as such. And for us, it's very important to follow it and analyze its consequences and to follow the discourse in order to support actors that can then challenge the backlash. So what we do is that we have formed an internal working group consisting of senior colleagues working for gender equality and SRHR and LGBTIQ rights. And together we share information internally, and we also make sure that we support our colleagues, both at embassies and within CEDA, and to enhance our knowledge on the backlash and to support partners to include it in their gender analysis so that it's always part of the gender equality work that we're doing. And we also raise it in dialogue, of course, with other donors and multilaterals, so that the issue is not managed separately, but is part of the overall work for gender equality and LGBTQI rights. We also have an internal goal. We have an internal action plan for gender equality. And one of these goals is to support women's rights organizations and increase the support to women's rights organizations, because we know that they are at the forefront for pushing the agenda for gender equality, but also against the backlash, and to support movement building and women's collective action so that they can have these kind of arenas to meet. And we know that the shrinking space is very much affecting them, of course, and that they can challenge the narrative that is brought forward by those that are behind the backlash. And this needs to be context specific. And therefore, it's also crucial that we have this kind of flexibility in our partnerships so that each and every one that we are working with can develop this kind of narrative in a way that suits their context. And what we also know is that it's important to have these kind of dedicated contributions to actors that are working against the backlash, like, for example, IDS. But we also need to continue our long efforts to build strong and sustainable foundations and systems. And that includes, of course, health education, social protection, legal, but also to support the inclusion of gender equality and democrats, if that is still used as a term, and gender equality capacity within institutions through, for example, gender budgeting and etc. And one of the, I think, questions that we will struggle with going ahead, we have a new government in Sweden, and they will present probably a reform agenda for the development aid, cooperation and humanitarian aid, and we're waiting for that. But it has been very clear that there will be an increased focus on results. So how do we measure partners' results of preventive action and also the work of countering the backlash? So it's something that we will need to continue to strategize around internally. And on the support to IDS and the cooperation with IDS, what we see is that it's at the very core and center is that we need to have this, we need to understand the backlash. And then this information needs to be transferred to those actors that are also fighting the backlash on the ground. And that is what this program aims to do. And we're very happy about this cooperation.
Thank you. So
Sorry.
we have a few
Thank
more
you very
minutes.
much. Yeah, we have, yes, absolutely.
And then the time. Okay.
So,
Anyone from the panel? Tessa, Mike?
Yeah, I mean, just on the results thing, and this is at the top of my mind because a bunch of us are writing this paper at the moment on kind of evidencing girl child work, and it's in reaction to having a donor that assumes that rights are not intrinsic and that one has to evidence why one should work on child participation and gender in this case. And I was thinking it's not just necessarily about providing results, it's maybe about reframing or re-educating those that call for the results and saying that, you know, you have to show why you can't in particular circumstances provide particular evidence and what you can provide differently. And I know other people like Ros Aben have written about this a lot in terms of the politics of evidence, but I do think there's something of a kind of value in very much reframing that. Not that you can necessarily.
Did you want to say something?
no, I'm just thinking of the neoliberal result again and the
Yes.
fact that it's very political.
Did you want to? Yeah.
A quick question to that is that also, I think, although I agree, is that if a very practical, on a very, very practical level, if we can't provide results, the funding might be steered towards another direction.
Yeah.
And I mean, that is something that we want to avoid, of course, because the funding towards women's rights organization globally is, as you all know, it's minimal, and towards gender equality as well. And it's part of the backlash that funding is being directed towards other causes. So we need to also continue to build a case. But I agree in theory, for sure.
Other points on this is not just necessarily on this agenda, but in terms of what it means for development studies and research, gender and development engagement with our funding world as well. So I think you wanted to come in
terms of results based.
Well, yeah, that's fine. You can continue.
No, was that the question? No.
No, sorry, I was trying to encourage us to include other aspects as well. I mean, the results agenda is one aspect, and I think I was reflecting to Nyla here, it's typically very neoliberal, but of course it's very convenient for backlash forces to pick that up again and reframe what kind of results. But sorry, I'm opining here rather than inviting other questions or suggestions.
Isn't that the kind of aid architecture and structure that we are under? I mean, it's not necessarily something that started with the current wave of backlash. I mean, you have to think about the Paris agenda and what it did to women's rights organizing in terms of it's not just the results framing, but sort of streamlining the accountability. Not that accountability agenda is bad, but then what does it impose? And it has an impact in the way that donors can fund certain kinds of work, or how creative and flexible can they be. And we all know that working on gender equality and women's rights and sexuality, it's not like you're going to get results like that. It's not that results are important. It is also about long-term sustained engagement and not being projectized, the work being projectized in a particular way. And that's something that we have been struggling with. But having said that, then within, people always have agency. It's not necessarily that donors haven't tried to be creative, or that there aren't allies within those organizations, or that funding hasn't worked in creative ways. Like when I think about Bangladesh and I think about the work on sex work, for example, it is because we had gender policy advocates in certain embassies. I've been thinking about Shirin Haq and others that created that space at a time when working on sex work would have been very controversial, and it pushed that work generated then moving on to other fields that you wouldn't have imagined. And those roles are so important, particularly given that what we are fighting right now and the funding that the backlash actors have is unimaginable. If you look at the Neil Dutta report and others, you just look at how the money's flowing and the amount, and you think, okay, what amount goes to women's rights organization and organizations working on sexuality and gender diversity? The fact that we are still countering and we are still here is a testament to our strength. I mean, we talk a lot about we have lost out space, we have lost out, we lost out some of the battles, some gains have been rolled back, but we are also fighting back with minimal resources. So that is something to also think about.
So thank you. I think this is a good point on that particular issue. I'm just thinking of, you mentioned Neil Dutta and the mapping of resources going to backlash actors and projects, forces, and then referring to that mapping, what the millions that they know of, the hundreds of millions that they know of being the tip of the iceberg, a very chilling kind of metaphor for what's really going on that side. But so on that slightly scary note, we want to open up the discussion and invite questions from the audience. We also have some questions online, but we'll start with questions from the audience in the room. So if we can have a couple of questions to begin with. Yes, Susie.
Hi. On this hot, hot day, I'm thinking about the climate crisis. And I'm wondering how that intersects with the backlash against gender, because sometimes it's the same people like Bolsonaro and Trump who are anti-gender and climate change denialists. But I'm also wondering if because it's such an existential crisis, can it bring together people who might otherwise disagree on things like gender? And on a personal note, I have a friend who used to be my feminist co-activist decades ago and now is a lead figure in the sex-based rights movement and focusing entirely on attacking transgender people. And we tried to have a discussion about what we can agree on to see if there was any common ground, and literally nothing around women, men, equality, gender. But on the climate crisis, we could both agree that that was the priority and that we should, if there's any possible way, ally around tackling that. So it was a kind of spot of hope, but in practical political terms, I don't know where that leaves us, but I'd love to hear what you think.
Okay, could probably take one more question now, and then we open it up to the panel. Rosen?
Thank you. It was really fascinating discussion. It's more of a comment, really. This last point that the panel was talking about to do with the results-based agenda. I think it's just really worth remembering that official public aid agencies' policies are doing that as well. So the way that the agenda in the UK has changed over the last 10 years from a rights-based approach to anything to do with women and gender to a much more needs-based, regressive, women and children need things kind of approach is very connected to backlash in our society, and it all kind of comes round. So I think, and I mean, the rights-based agenda the same, it's a reflection of corporativism within the development NGO sector. But I think that's a particular problem of public official aid agencies, and it's why some of the philanthropies are so interesting to lots of us now, because they're not bound by those same constraints.
So anybody on the...
I'll take Susie's. I think I'd like to take Susie's, and I think you've made two very important points, right? Well, many important points, but I'm going to be on two. The first is the climate change issue. And I think we've talked about it in this meeting. And, you know, it's something I've very recently, like everybody, realized you can't pretend it's going to go away. And for me, I think one of the strands that have led to where we are today in terms of, you know, looking over into the abyss is, you know, we know climate has been destroyed for many centuries, industrialization, etc. But we also know that the pace of change has accelerated with the shift to unregulated markets, unregulated globalization, and the commodification of everything, right? And therefore means, you know, natural resources are just another form of commodity, and the destruction we do does not count because it doesn't come up in market values. So I think, and then in there is what Fraser has talked about, which is the commodification of care and the extent to which unpaid care only becomes valuable when it becomes a commodity in the market. And so I think for somewhere in the background, there is an affinity between feminists who've been fighting for recognition of all the unpaid and, you know, the care economy, and ecological activists who've been fighting for recognition of nature. And both of them are unified in the resistance, not just to unregulated labor markets, but to a growth paradigm that is driven by a profit motive, purely a profit motive, and has been increasingly financialized. So there I see there is huge and necessary alliances to be made. The second important point is you and your friend, right? Because I also think when we talk about the counter to globalization, to backlash, to what extent can we get a united platform of people who agree around the core issues of progressive values, or however you define them, but some degree, and for me, uncompromisingly about equality, you know, of all people, regardless. So driven to some extent by social media, the fracturing of former alliances and the fracturing of former friendships. So then I ask myself, how come the right is so unified in its attack? And how come the progressive people are so divided each one of them defending a piece of the turf that they think is most under attack. So I tell that to myself as well, because I'm one of the people that takes a very hard line stand and said, I'm not budging from this. I have to budge. I really have to budge, because what's happening on climate, we may not live to see it, but those of us with children and them with their children's children is going to look back on this generation. So there's two things there: the affinity between gender justice and climate justice, and secondly, who are we to talk about a unified platform if we cannot unify around this most existential of all crises?
Can I say something?
Thanks, Naila. So did you want to come in? Yeah, and then I'll come to you.
Okay, so I mean, I've always thought about this whole idea of how feminists negotiate power, and we have. I think this is something that we need to really rethink, because we need to negotiate power. We have to do compromises, right? And I mean, personally, also, I've been in spaces where people are very hardliners about very specific issues, but then you lose, really. So I think I mean, I don't know, can we perhaps imagine that there's a difference between sort of, the scholar, the intellectual, the activist, the radical, but also the person who can who's in the room, negotiating, and how do we make sure that the person in the room gets the support of the people outside who are very radical, who perhaps are not very happy. But then this division of roles, I think, is really important for us as feminists to think about, to be able to form alliances with very unlikely people.
Thank you. Did you want to?
Yeah, can I use this?
Yeah.
Just very briefly, I wanted to respond to what you said, Susie. And the first one is related to the discussion around care, and it's what the lens of COVID affords to thinking about kind of extreme inequities and the kind of rapacious nature of late capital and capitalism. And that is this idea of interdependency and the importance of focusing on that, both as a feminist movement, but also more broadly in terms of that us being in this together. And of course, many people pointed out that that wasn't the case during COVID. But I really think that kind of interdependency as a kind of nature symbolism is very important to focus on. And then the other thing was around the urgency of linking anti-backlash work to climate change and to the climate crisis, because there is a quite well-documented connection between the anti-capitalist movement and the anti-gender movement. And that is seen as kind of one of the drivers of the anti-gender movement. And there's some interesting writing emerging that looks at that. And so I think it's very incumbent on us to start tackling that.
Thank you. So let's take another, or were there any other responses to this?
Vast number of participants online. And
There are, yes, and there are some questions. There's a lot of expressions of interest, and there is a question I might as well take that one now. I found one. And Gary, please help if you can find other questions that I think Veda was asking to Sohela's point about what is true equality, especially in the private sphere vis-a-vis the public. Do we wait for it to happen in one for it to influence the other? I mean, we did have
We had
a debate about that, but does anybody want to add to that debate? The personal is political, and
I just want to say hi to Veda.
and I'm watching a lot of former students, which is very encouraging. Here, Tony Mwiba and Amanda Hammerlund, I believe, and many others online. So that's very encouraging, and we're very happy to have you online. Can we have another couple of questions here? And if any, and Gary, if any questions come in online, please let me know, and we'll try and bring them in. Any other questions in the room to the panel on anything we've discussed? Yes.
Bit of a non sequitur, but this thing that, feminists in my generation, the personal is political. And I think my discussion with Sohela is also about the political is personal. you know, I mean, we forgot that side of it because we took it for granted. But I think personal
Yes.
is very, very political, but we can use the political to leverage around the personal.
Great. So that adds to the conversation that we had on that topic, hopefully
But I've got two things
answering.
about that.
Yeah.
So I think it's interesting that of all the areas of equal rights that we fought for, to my great surprise, political participation, specifically representation in former politics, is the area of the biggest gender gap. So if you look at the World Economic Forum, we're equal on education and health. It's definitional things, right? Problems, but still we're equal. Labor market participation is falling. It's been falling since the year 2000. That's not good. But political participation is stuck. It in fact recently went down, right? So around 25%. The gender gap is 75%. So there is an element of the backlash, which is this sense of visceral howl of rage at women seizing entitlement, women acting in an entitled way. And you know, we have many doubts about what difference it makes to have women in politics. Sure. But when you have a critical mass, even in a Catholic country, you get abortion rights, even in Latin America, even in Ireland. There is something to it. There are reasons for men to be afraid. And so, you know, it comes back to this really interesting question, which I think is not resolved, which is the backlash, is it just a distraction from the deep structural changes to the economy and climate, which has displaced men from their privileges, and they're taking it out on women? And let's not forget immigrants and anybody who's not as white as they are. So it's like is it a reaction to those structural changes, or is it organized, systematic? Is there something, you know, kind of more planned behind it? Tessa has something immediately to say about that. And certainly women in politics is a great, at least feminist in politics is a way to address that. I want to say something else very briefly about law and norms. Years ago, one of my first students on the MA in gender, Joanna Kerr, who you may know, she's gone on to great heights. She's a picture of her in the stairway, pretty cool. She said to me when she was head of Greenpeace in Canada, she said, I'm done with normative change. Forget normative change. We're done. We got stuck at Beijing. I'm done with normative change. Apartheid, what I had meant to say, and I forgot when I was talking about the racial discrimination norms and laws internationally, is that by looking at those laws and comparing racial apartheid to the possibility of discussing gender apartheid, is I realized the legal grounds for protesting gender-based discrimination are much weaker than the legal grounds for protesting racial discrimination, which is extremely interesting. So CEDAW defends equality and attacks gender-based discrimination in a much weaker way than the racial convention of 10 years before that. And that's never been corrected, which is quite interesting.
The signatories to it.
They're both almost universally signed, almost, right, with, you know, reservations. But CEDAW, as we know, is the most reserved. Anyway, so I think that there is still space for thinking about if we're countering the backlash. I mean, maybe there is no space for making normative progress internationally. That's possible. But it's remarkable to see that we've ended up with surprisingly puny tools, actually, to fight it. So that's a concern.
Great. Any further questions in the room first? So you did speak. Sorry, you did have a reaction.
I was just reacting to Anne-Marie's thing.
Distracted.
You asked, yeah, I've got my microphone. You said we haven't answered the question about whether backlash was some kind of deep reflex to an existential crisis or whether it was intentional and organized, and I was just going to say, or both, right?
Yes.
For sure. Yeah, but also what you said about entitlement, I thought was quite interesting. I don't know if Jacqueline Rose's new work on gender-based violence, and she says something in the introduction to that book, which is kind of very obvious but very profound, and I'd never honestly thought about it in quite that way until I read it, and we had quite a long discussion about it, which was around men's entitlement to women's bodies. Mm-hmm. And that kind of notion of that entitlement being taken away as a property right, in a sense, I think is, yeah, it's just struck me in that.
Great.
Actually, I was just going to say that I'm surprised that we even have a puny tool, because given the way things are negotiated and given the fact that CEDAW was in 1979, at that time, like, I'm just surprised it got through in the first place, given the politics of it. Because I guess in this world, in a sense, like, recognition is a debated issue, but in terms of when you say social movements lead to norm change or recognition, but as soon as you touch distribution, it is always goes much deeper. And we have to touch distribution. There's no way you're going to have equality without redistribution. So the fight back would be a lot more the entitlements and the privileges and everything else that we are asking back for or fighting back for.
I also think this, it's very telling, these global gender gaps. You know, the fact that we have managed to close the gender gaps on human capabilities, health, education, and so on. So whatever country you're in, governments are not resistant to the idea of investing in maternal mortality, child health, and so on. We have not done so well on economic opportunities. You say it's rising, but you know, after COVID, women's labor force participation plunged, but it remains a very obstinate gap. But the largest gap is on political opportunities. So it is possible to make progress at the level of basic human needs and human capabilities. Why is it not possible to make progress? So, I mean, to me, that is very, very telling. So even when you have these quotas, etc., they're reinterpreted in ways that keep power intact in class, gender privileges, you know.
So, yes, we have, and I'm consciously aware that we do have some questions online. We also have one more question from our student from Mongolia, whose name sadly escapes me, but you'll have to get a link, from Ulaanbaatar, I hope, or believe rather. So we have a few questions in the chat line from Emily Wilson, asking about the role of the private sector in images of women's and men's bodies, and particularly around children's toys and pink and blue and so on, which is an issue that certainly comes into this. And then there is Jonna Dilder, who is asking, how can feminist activists be more engaged in a more co-creative way against backlash? These are some quite big questions. Colin Anderson also has a question about relating to the discussion around the targeting of LGBTQI identities. And I'm trying to fish it out here, but my dexterity on Zoom is under challenge. Yeah, oops. So in the meantime, I'm going to ask for a question on the floor. Do you want to ask your question?
Thank you. Just I wanted to say that this is the hugest number of panel who can discuss also very alive and like interestingly within this huge group. I just wanted to say, yeah, and I think I have three questions which are connected with each other, and like since we are talking about interdependency within the feminist movement and also intergenerational kind of linkage within the movement, right? I wanted to ask that, like, kind of your personal coping mechanism against this backlash, which is happening worldwide, and also we can see and feel it in our everyday life, in the level of our personal body and also social body, right? Which is not easy. So I wanted to ask your personal experiences and strategies in the personal level. And secondly, I have been thinking about men, like how patriarchy is using and making them kind of as a gatekeeper of patriarchal culture, feeding them with some privileges, right? And if we want to talk and address about this power shift, right? And I think it's like even financially, economically, like worldwide, I think men have more power, obviously, than women. So when they're keeping kind of, brainwashed with the privilege, given the privilege from the structure, how kind of do we work with the men? I'm talking about men in general, right? Not men in this room. Yeah. And thirdly,
I'm not sure we're gonna have time for all the questions, to be honest.
okay, just third one is just like general strategy. Like, do you suggest or do you believe in peaceful, creative way of fight against this backlash? Or like, would you suggest us to use our anger or, power against this backlash? Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much. And apologies to everyone who hasn't really had their questions aired, at least. So I think Colin Anderson was asking some commentary around the way that the LGBTIQ issue and controversies become exploited in backlash, and the extent to which when we respond to this, we risk feeding into this binary trap, essentially, is the way I read the question. But so we have some more questions from the floor, and we have only a couple of minutes left, technically, which means that I think we should give everybody half a minute to respond to any of those questions, if that's okay. And I'll start with myself, with men's internalized patriarchal assumptions and so on. And the first thing is, again, this is the binary trap that to some extent relates to what Colin was speaking about. The world isn't binary. Yes, most of the backlash actors are men, and it's rooted in male supremacy and privilege. And we need to take decisions and make choices political choices about where we stand on social justice. So I'll hand the microphone over to you, Anne-Marie, and hopefully you can pick one of those questions.
They're all terrific questions. Can't answer them all. I'm going to take your very last one, which is about anger. And I thank you for raising that. Actually, it has come up in our discussions that affect, men's howl of outrage, men's visceral reaction and fear, that we have to understand it. And nobody knows what to do with it or how to deal with it. No one ever talks about women's fury. Our fury. There were two books written simultaneously in the US when Trump won the election. They were both called Anger by Women. They were both, Good and Mad and Women's Anger, and we're not allowed to be angry. I, however, would not advocate an anger-based social movement. And I genuinely wouldn't, even though I believe we have every entitlement to be so angry, and I am. I'm so angry. But that's no place, that's no way to go. Violence is no solution. And violence has been used by patriarchs to police the boundaries of gender in ways that we cannot stand and we cannot accept. So the thing is, how can we channel, but also be honest about our anger? So thank you for raising that. And I think that there needs to be a lot more space for understanding affect, and also for men to see and feel our anger, except not violently.
Thank you. So I had a question about how feminists could be more co-creative, and just from a very practical point as representing a donor agency, I think it's crucial that they also have resources to do this and safe spaces to do this. And what in general women rights organizations or actors working for gender equality and gender transformative change is also to find the argument of why this co-creation is so important. Again, steer away slightly from the results, hence and have the argumentation for it themselves, because co-creation is crucial for movement building, and we need this in order to push back the backlash. Thanks.
So I control my anger, but I've decided now, I'm 64, so I've decided that I can be, and I'm allowed to be, a feminist killjoy, to use Sarah Ahmed's term, which I think is brilliant.
And yes, so yes, I allow myself to correct and comment and really make people uncomfortable, whereas I never used to do that because I used to be like sort of like this nice person who's trying to accommodate everybody, but I stopped doing that. And I've stopped doing that for a while, and I really vowed myself never to accept, these sort of things. So, and I get away with it because I'm 64.
Yeah. Myla?
In the 70s, you used to see these slogans on walls saying, women are angry, right? I mean, it was there from that point. It used to be a very common slogan. But I agree, anger is very counterproductive. And anger does not address what I think is, something that Tessa brought up and that Susie brought up is, and I think it was Joe Morrow that said, what unites us is far greater than what divides us. And so for me, it's looking for those interconnections, the interconnected nature of oppression, in spite of, the concept of intersectionality. The way that we are oppressed is very often around our identities and our resources. The form that the misrecognition takes may differ according to the kind of identities we're talking about. But I do think that commonality of oppression should still be something that we can unify around. And I also think our common stake in our stake in a common future, the commons of the future is something else. So for me, really the challenge today is how does one get that kind of unified platform against the backlash and in favor of, a more sustainable, a viable planet.
Okay, so Garalee, what kind of means? Peaceful means, violent means, and do we get angry? It's human to be angry. If you are treated as a secondary citizen or not equal, that's a normal reaction, but it's about what do you do with that anger? Lashing out never helps. You don't get angry, you get even. You become strategic, right? And it might feel at times that you're being you feel the burden also that why do you always need to be strategic? Why do you always have to think about long term? Why should you be the one how do I reach out and create allies? But it's also about end goals. So obviously, yes, you do want legal changes. You do want the equal wages, etc. And you do want redistribution. So those are concrete changes that can be brought through policies and laws and everything. But the real change happens when people who are opposing you actually normatively shift. And I think, I mean, yes, I'm an idealist, and that's where I want to go. And I know it's impossible, not everyone would change, but that's what I would like to work for. There is definitely a way to show people that everyone is human. So that's where I'll stop.
Thank you. I'll start where you stopped. I completely agree with you. Anger is a human feeling. I come from a society where men are allowed to be angry, almost justified. When a man abuses their partner, often society will say, well, she must have angered him. So it's almost acceptable to be angry. But life-affirming and nurturing attributes are never assigned to men. Caring, compassionate, loving, it's not manly. Well, I would agitate that we have to be angry. I've been angry myself against apartheid, and I think the question is, what do you do with that anger feeling? How do you channel it that it moves you to change? And I don't think I qualify as a man to say to women, don't be angry. You obviously living in a patriarchal society, I mean, I can understand why you can't be angry. The bigger question is, how do we transform that into movement that changes what is confronting us? And I want to pitch for the allyship between men and women in transformation agenda, because I need to walk this path with my sisters in ensuring that we change what we see in society. It's not enough for me to simply say, no, these women are too angry. I need to be able to say, how do I work with them? How do I understand where they are working, why they are confronted by the situation that they find themselves in? And it's my responsibility, therefore, to make a contribution to a society that I think treats everybody fairly, equally, and with respect and dignity. So anger in on of itself is not bad. It's how we channel it so that it helps us move and transform society.
Thanks, Fafana. I think we're out of time. I'm going to speak very quickly. I was going to say something flippant, which was about friends and food and music and reading and art being the survival strategies for me personally, but also something about the sharedness that you picked up on, because it's a bugbear of mine, that intersectionality is often used to articulate individualized identities rather than emphasize shared structural oppressions. So,
Well, it's interlocking systems of oppression.
yeah.
What is the event? Oh, I don't. Sure.
Oh, yeah, this one. Is this better?
Okay, so this brings us to, on that point, I was just echoing your thought, Bell Hooks's interlocking systems of oppression as another way to look at, or looking at intersectionality from above or from a different perspective. So on that note, we will actually close this event, and it has been a wonderful to see so many of you here and so many more online. And sincere apologies to all of you, or those of you who didn't have your specific questions answered, but hopefully there was enough stimulation. And as I said in a message to when to IDS comes, there will be other discussions. The struggle goes on. So join us in the movement to counter backlash. Thank you so much, everyone. Hope to see you again in the near future. Thanks.
Yeah.